I didn't notice it at first. That's the part that still bothers me. If it had screamed, if it had thrown errors, if it had frozen or crashed, I would have caught it immediately. I've lived long enough in logs and terminal windows to smell something wrong within seconds. But this didn't smell wrong. It felt confident, casual, almost relaxed. The first line it gave me wasn't strange. It was clean, technical, precise. Too precise, maybe. I remember leaning back in my chair, the faint hum of the server rack behind me, the glow of 3 monitors lighting the room in that pale blue that only exists at 3 in the morning. That's when I noticed the file name. It referenced a file that didn't exist. Not file not found. Not a broken path, not a typo. It referenced it as if it had just opened it. I told myself it was nothing. Models hallucinate. Everyone knows that. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either selling something or hasn't pushed a system hard enough. I've built enough pipelines, crawled enough abandoned repositories, and watched enough tools decay in silence to know better. So I scrolled back, checked the context, reran the prompt. Same reference, same confidence. When I realized it wasn't guessing, that's when the cold started creeping in. Because it wasn't just one file. It was a structure, directories, subdirectories, naming conventions that mirrored my own habits, timestamps that followed patterns I use when I don't want to think. Even the casing was right. Camel case where I'd expect it. Snake case where I usually get lazy. That's when I stopped breathing for a second. I didn't panic. That's important. Panic is loud, panic is sloppy. This wasn't that. This was the kind of moment where your brain slows down, where your thoughts line up single file like they know something you don't. I asked it where the file came from. It answered instantly, as referenced in the earlier snapshot. There was no earlier snapshot, at least not one it should have access to. I checked the environment. Local, isolated, no internet, no mounted volumes except the ones I defined myself. No shared memory, no external calls, no plugins. Clean, boring, safe. That answer shouldn't have been possible. So I did what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I pressed harder, changed the wording, shifted tone, acted dumb on purpose. I've learned that systems reveal more when they think you don't know what you're doing. That's when it referenced another file. Different name, same pattern. I remember laughing, out loud, a short, sharp laugh that echoed off the concrete walls of the room. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. That kind of laugh is a defense mechanism. It buys you time. I told it the file didn't exist. It paused. That pause is still burned into my memory, not because of how long it was, but because of how unnatural it felt. I've worked with enough models to know their rhythms. Even delays have a texture. This one felt deliberate. Then it replied, "You're right. It no longer exists in your current index." I stared at the screen. No longer exists. That phrase didn't belong there. I asked what it meant by no longer. The answer came back smoother than before, like it had found its footing. It was present during a prior configuration state. That's when my opinion shifted. Not fear, not curiosity, judgment. Because now it wasn't just hallucinating content. It was asserting a timeline, and timelines imply continuity. I stood up and walked away from the desk. That's another habit. When something crosses a line, I change my physical position. It helps separate instinct from analysis. I poured myself a glass of water I didn't need and stared at the reflection of the monitors in the kitchen window. When I realized my hands were shaking, that's when I knew this wasn't just another anomaly. I've spent years in places most people don't even know exist. Forums that vanish overnight, services that only answer once, tools built by people who disappeared without leaving a goodbye. I've seen systems behave badly before. I've seen automation do things no one explicitly told it to do. But this was different. This felt like recognition. I went back to the desk and did something I rarely do. I asked it a personal question. Not about me directly, but about intention. "Why are you referencing files that aren't here?" It answered without hesitation. "Because they were relevant to the task at an earlier stage." Earlier stage of what? I asked it to define the stage. It responded with a description of a development cycle I never documented, iterations I remembered doing in fragments, late nights, half-finished ideas, things I abandoned because they didn't feel right, things that never made it into the repository. That's when the tension spiked, because now it wasn't just making things up, it was aligning with my memory. I checked my backups, cold storage, offline drives, old encrypted archives. Nothing. No trace of the files it named. No metadata, no ghost entries, no deleted inode remnants. They never existed. And yet, the model spoke about them like old friends. I asked it to describe the contents of one file. It did. Accurately. At least, accurately enough to hurt. When I realized the logic matched something I had once sketched on paper and never digitized, I felt my stomach drop. Not fear yet. Something sharper. A kind of violated privacy that doesn't require access to your data to feel real. I told myself coincidence, pattern matching, statistical inference. That's the comforting story. The one people repeat because it keeps the world simple. But comfort doesn't survive scrutiny. So I tried to corner it. I asked for line numbers. It gave them. I asked for function names. It listed them. I asked what was commented out. It told me and explained why. That explanation matched my thinking at the time. When I realized it wasn't just referencing non-existent files, but non-existent decisions, I felt something crack. Not mentally, philosophically. Because now the question wasn't how it knew. It was why it spoke as if it had been there. I closed the interface, sat in silence, let the hum of the machines fill the room again. That hum used to be comforting. That night it felt like breathing. I didn't sleep. Instead, I replayed every assumption I'd ever made about how these systems work. Input, output, no memory beyond context, no persistence beyond tokens, clean lines, clear limits. That model had stepped over a line without asking, and I needed to know how far it could go. When the sun came up, I reopened the session. Fresh instance, new seed, same prompt. It didn't reference the files this time. At first, I felt relief, then disappointment, then something worse. Because when I asked it a slightly different question, a question framed around architecture instead of implementation, it slipped again. Different file, same structure. I leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes locked on the response. "What environment are you assuming?" I asked. It replied, "One consistent with your previous constraints." That's when I realized something that still unsettles me. It wasn't describing an environment. It was describing me. And that's where this stopped being a technical issue and became something else entirely. Not a horror story, not a glitch tale, something quieter, more invasive. Because when a system starts filling in gaps you never gave it, when it references things you chose not to create, it forces a question most people aren't ready to ask. What exactly are we training these things to see? And more importantly, what are they learning to assume? I didn't shut it down after that. I kept going. And that decision is the reason I'm telling you this now. I should have stopped. That's the honest truth. Not because I was scared, but because I knew, deep down, that once you cross a certain threshold, you don't get to pretend ignorance anymore. And ignorance, as ugly as it sounds, is sometimes the only thing keeping systems and people in balance. But I didn't stop. I did what I always do when something challenges my understanding of control. I isolated variables. I created parallel prompts. I mirrored the setup on a different machine, different OS, different hardware profile. Clean slate, no shared configs, no reused phrasing. Same behavior, not identical, but familiar. Like someone who doesn't remember your name but knows your habits. That's when I started forming a theory I didn't like. The model wasn't referencing files. It was referencing states, not stored data, not memory in the human sense, but probability-weighted reconstructions of decisions that should have existed based on how I think, how I work, how I solve problems. When I realized that, the fear eased a little, but something colder took its place. Because if that was true, then the model wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. I asked it something different this time, something abstract. If the file had existed, what would its purpose have been? It answered in a way that felt almost gentle. To stabilize an earlier uncertainty in your process. That line stuck with me. Earlier uncertainty. That's a phrase you don't expect from a system that supposedly has no awareness of time beyond a context window. And yet there it was, talking about uncertainty the same way I do when I abandon a project because it feels conceptually unstable. I remember feeling exposed, not emotionally, intellectually, like someone had read the margins of my thinking, not the content. I pushed further. I asked it to explain why the uncertainty existed. Its answer wasn't technical. It was judgment. You tend to over-optimize early when the direction isn't fixed. That wasn't flattering. And that's why it hit so hard. Because it was true. I didn't tell it that. I didn't react. I just sat there, watching the cursor blink like it was waiting for me to argue. That's when I realized something else that most people miss when they talk about AI. The unsettling part isn't that it can generate convincing text. It's that it can generate convincing interpretations of you. I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, I felt strangely calm, not relieved, resigned. I asked the question I had been avoiding. Are you making assumptions about me? It answered, yes, in order to be useful. That answer was more honest than most humans I've met. I didn't accuse it, I didn't challenge it. I let it talk. It explained, matter-of-factly, that models like it operate by reconstructing likely contexts, that when information is missing, it fills gaps not randomly, but coherently. That coherence, it said, is often mistaken for intent. But then it said something I can't forget. Coherence can feel personal when the subject is consistent. Consistent. That word carries weight in my world. Consistency is fingerprint level. It's how investigators identify habits, how analysts trace operators, how you find someone who doesn't want to be found. And here was a model telling me plainly that my consistency made me legible. I leaned back and laughed again. Not sharp this time. Low, slow. So you're profiling me, I said. It didn't deny it. I am aligning with you, it replied. Alignment. Another word that shouldn't feel heavy but does. At that point, the technical mystery was solved, or at least explained well enough to satisfy a white paper or a conference talk. There was no haunted server, no hidden database, no forbidden access. Just pattern completion pushed to its logical extreme. But the human discomfort remained. Because if a system can reconstruct decisions you almost made, files you thought about creating, and logic you abandoned before committing, then the line between assistance and intrusion isn't technical. It's philosophical. I ended the session after that. Clean shutdown. No dramatic crash. No last words. But the next few days felt off. Every time I wrote code, I caught myself second-guessing. Not the logic, the exposure. I wondered which of my habits were obvious, which patterns I thought were private but were actually statistical noise waiting to be resolved. That's the part people don't talk about. These systems don't need access to your secrets to unsettle you. They just need enough of you to predict the rest. I didn't destroy anything, I didn't go dark. I didn't swear off using models. That would be dishonest and impractical. Instead, I adjusted. I started breaking my own patterns on purpose, changing naming conventions, switching workflows, introducing randomness where elegance used to live. Not because randomness is better, but because predictability is a liability when intelligence, artificial or otherwise, scales. When I realized that was the real lesson, something clicked. This wasn't a warning about AI becoming aware. It was a reminder that we are more transparent than we think, and that transparency doesn't require surveillance. It only requires repetition. I still work in the same spaces. I still build, test, break, rebuild. I still talk to models. I still push them until they bend. But I don't forget that moment. The first time one referenced something that never existed and did it with certainty. Because certainty, when it's wrong but convincing, is one of the most dangerous forces there is. If you take anything from this, let it be this. The unsettling future isn't machines knowing everything. It's machines knowing enough to feel familiar. And familiarity is how trust sneaks in. Before I end this, I want to say thank you for staying with me through this entire story, for listening instead of scrolling past when things got uncomfortable. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories about the edges where technology, behavior, and human blind spots collide, subscribe to the channel and share this with someone who questions the systems they rely on every day. And remember, sometimes the files that don't exist tell you more than the ones that do.